and in my view, Jesus' life was in continuity with these experiences of immigration that had shaped Jesus' people for millennia. And Jesus chose, or had chosen for him several times where he lived and experienced life as an immigrant of one sort or another. That is not just a desire that Jesus act like others prior to him. God came to earth in Jesus to experience what human life was like. And in human life, immigration is a fact in almost every culture. We actually, at this point in U.S. history, have a much lower percentage of our population who were not born in the U.S. than at almost any time in our 200-plus year history. We're at about 12 to 15%. A whole lot of these centuries, that number was 25 to 30%. A few times it hit highs of 40%. That means almost half of the people you would know in life moved to this country and were not born here, with 1,000 different stories behind each one of them. And repeatedly, government has tried to limit immigration. And in every time, it causes oppression of people. And about a generation later, causes a great downturn in the economy and in the quality of life. The 1865 Chinese Exclusion Act that tried to gather up and remove Chinese people from the U.S. because they were taking white people's jobs, led to the economic collapse of the 1890s. And that set the stage for the global crash for which World War I was a solution or a response. In the 20s, we again dialed back on immigration, and it created huge economic disruption and mass poverty for the Great Depression. And we didn't get out of the Great Depression until World War II. In 1965, we changed immigration law considerably to allow about 100 times more immigrants to enter the U.S. And then in the 70s, 80s, 90s, we had strong economy. In the 80s, we started dialing that back, and we've had several recessions about a generation after that. I don't need the Bible to prove that high immigration rates are really good for our cities and communities. American history, just about every other country around the world would prove that point. My point is not just that it's good for us, but that it's God's will for us. So when God decided to come down in flesh and see what was going on in the Gospels, the Gospel of John describes it in a lovely fashion that we sometimes translate into something more blank. But John says that God pitched a tent among us for a while in the human form of Jesus. That this was temporary. This was passing through. This was God leaving God's house and living in a different place, without all of the creature comforts that God was accustomed to, like angels and streets of gold and all that. And so God choosing to become the immigrant Jesus is what we celebrate at Christmas time as one of the great moments of our faith. Jesus was born into the family with Joseph and Mary. And they were living in a couple hundred miles to the north of Jerusalem, in the area of Galilee. It was an area that had, back in a lot of Israelite history, been the wildlands, the borderlands. There was a lot of cultural conflict because 100 years before Jesus, the Greek armies started using empty land in Galilee to establish colonies. The colonies were actually retirement homes for soldiers. And it was one of the great recruiting. When they were recruiting people into the armies, the promise was you'll get a meal every day, you'll have meaningful work, you'll have people to protect you, and if you survive all that, you will get your own house in a place of our choosing. In a very impoverished borderland area, but still, free retirement's a good incentive. So Joseph and Mary must have lived a lot of their life up in that Galilee area. And that means they were surrounded by immigrants. It was an immigrant majority set of cities and counties. And they all came in speaking Greek. Maybe they had grown up speaking something else, but Greek was their language of work for the army. And so I think Joseph and Mary, whatever they grew up speaking at home, by the time they are young adults and adults in the Galilee area, they've got to be bilingual and speaking in Greek. That's what would be spoken in every marketplace, every school, every transaction. It was the language of the government. And if you're going to get by, you have to know that. Then a Roman emperor said it was time for a census. And a census, I mean, here in the United States, we go through a census every 10 years. Anymore, I hardly notice it. There's a form that comes in the mail or by email, and I fill it out, and it's got some yes or no, true, false type questions, and a few places where I put in my age and ethnicity and all that. It gets used by government to decide congressional districts and things like that, but we don't really feel those effects very quickly unless you're in one of those areas where your congressperson changes in a few years. But a census in the Roman Empire was very disruptive. In fact, it was usually a tool of the government deciding to weaken the bonds between people who might rebel by moving them all around the country. So think for a minute what would happen to Cathedral City or any of our communities or any of our congregations if suddenly by government order everyone was told to move back to where their great-grandparents lived. Well, I would be in western Nebraska where I really don't know anyone anymore. And they can probably tell that I don't speak with a Nebraskan accent and I don't know the things my grandparents knew how to do. And so, plus there's all the expense of getting from here to Nebraska to sit around for a week or two and wait for a government clerk to check me in. But that's everybody going away. And while I was in Nebraska for the census, my house here would be unoccupied. If the government suspected anything of me, they could search the house while I was gone. They could plant evidence. Or someone in town who doesn't have a place to stay could break in and take it over and trash it. And so I'm out of work for about a month. I have travel expenses. I have a lot of risks. I might choose to go back. I might not. I think everyone will make their own decision. So it's very disruptive. It stops all normal life. It takes each individual family out of their network, out of their community, and takes them to a place that they're supposedly from, but it's a strange place to almost everyone. That's what Joseph and Mary were going through with that month of relocation and having shoddy accommodations while in a town she'd never been in. The timing is that month started about her 8.5 month of pregnancy. So she did the 200-mile ride by donkey, very pregnant, had the child in a barn. And the next step in that Christmas story of Jesus' birth that a lot of preachers skip over in early January is that the king, the Greek appointed king of the area named Herod, had heard, probably from the same guys we call the 3 wise men who came to Jesus. He had heard from them that a new king had been born, and they were looking for that new king. The current king did not want there to be a new king, did not want his dynasty replaced, didn't want to lose his job, so he handled it legally. Wasn't exactly sure when that child had been born, but it must have been in the last 2 years, he reasoned. So it became illegal to be male and under 2. Every child that was male that was under 2 years old would be gathered up and executed by the government, just so that he would be sure not to have any risk at all. So as this was happening, and Joseph and Mary were watching all of the other people with young boys get their families taken and killed, Joseph and Mary did the salvific thing. They became immigrants. I think it would be better to call them refugees. Their homeland had been up to the north and the Jerusalem, Bethlehem area was the part of the south it seemed they had ever traveled. So they marched into the desert and through the desert and out the other side to the south in a very hazardous trek. We know that they had a mule to get from Galilee to Bethlehem, but a mule doesn't walk in the desert very well. And so they crossed Saudi Arabia on foot with only the little possessions they had they could take with them. And they relocated to Egypt. When they started there, and Jesus, I'm presuming was 1 or 2 when he got there, he would know that at home there was some Aramaic being spoken and some Greek being spoken, but everybody else on the street speaks Egyptian. So what language is a 2-year-old going to learn? They're going to learn some of their parents' language and a lot of the language of their friends. And they're probably going to think it's a neat, Jesus is probably thinking it's a neat trick that he can answer his parents in a language they don't speak and see what he can get away with. They live in a refugee community until he's about 12. And we have no reason to think that that refugee community was any better or fancier than the things we see on our news today about refugee communities. One of the churches I'm working with in this presbytery is looking at a way to build a coalition to bring a refugee family into their community for church members and others to support. Most of the refugees they're looking at, or that are being worked with by this organization, most are Southern European, and most of them have lived at least 10 years in a refugee camp, during which time they've had very little shelter from heat or cold, poor nutrition, no educational systems, not much of a functioning water system. That 10 years takes a toll. And so the church here in California is thinking about how do we help those people transition to a very different culture, to a much more complicated life, but something so different. So there's a bit of a debate that some people take as a real matter of faith. We know that later in the Gospels, people ask Jesus about how his brothers are doing. And he answers them. And usually answers that my brothers aren't my business anymore. Or you'd have to go ask my mom, or something like that. Some Christians have believed that Mary was a perpetual virgin. And so they translate Jesus' brothers, the about a dozen of them, as cousins or childhood friends. But I don't see any problem believing what the Bible says, that they really are younger brothers of Jesus. If so, they would have all been born, however many there were, in Egypt. And they would grow up not speaking much besides Egyptian. So when Jesus moves back into the Israel area when he's about 12, they seem to move back up into the Galilee area, around Nazareth. Nazareth's a rough town. One of the problems was that all those former Greek soldiers, the Greek army developed technology that allowed more of them to live than expected, and that tore apart their calculations for retirement planning. They had figured that they might need one house for every 4 soldiers, because the others would die in battle, but they were doing better than that. And so there was a housing shortage, and that led to nearly half the population of Nazareth living in the streets, living in poverty with a government that didn't fulfill its promises to. So that was a rough town. And Jesus comes in early teens. All of his brothers are speaking Egyptian. Jesus, I think, was speaking some Aramaic and Greek and Egyptian. The Egyptian would have been the major language that he grew up from 2 to 12. And so it would be kind of his dominant language. I don't think he ever spoke like the people in Galilee. I think he went through the rest of his life with an Egyptian accent. And if you learn one language from 2 to 12, no matter how fluent you get in another language, some of the accent remains and becomes a source of discrimination, of people making fun of Jesus. So in the Nazareth area, Jesus as a Jew is an ethnic minority, mostly speaking in the language of a foreign body where he had grown up as a refugee. When God came down to be in human flesh, this is the kind of choice God made. To have gone through immigration, homelessness, refugee status, being a linguistic minority multiple times over before teenage years. Now, I have the presumption the general language of Jews in that area was Aramaic. Aramaic's close to Hebrew, but just far enough away that if you read one, that doesn't mean you know how to read the other. If one of you is speaking Aramaic and the other is speaking Hebrew, there are plenty of places where communication will fall apart even if you recognize a number of the words. So I think Jesus must have learned Scripture in Hebrew as an adult. We have a story about him studying with the rabbis in Jerusalem and staying there longer than his parents noticed. We have stories of Jesus pulling out a scroll in his first sermon and opening it to a certain page and knowing how to read or knowing by heart the Hebrew words of that part of Scripture. So that must have been adult learning. And so he was able to read things a bit freshly. We know very little about Jesus from ages 12 to age 30. We know that at age 12, his father Joseph is still in the story, When we start hearing about the story later, Mary is a widow. Whether that happens when Jesus is 14 or 28, no way to know. But as Jesus grows up, and for at least some of those years is the oldest man in the family, with maybe a half dozen younger brothers to feed along with his mother. And possibly living homeless because they're in a city where half of the people are homeless. I think we could make an assumption that the most likely thing is that Jesus was in and out of homelessness. He kept being categorized as an immigrant and not really one of us by the majority population who were Greek soldiers. And that life was a struggle because immigrants aren't usually treated well. People have discrimination against non-native speakers of the language. They're not given the same opportunities or presumed to be as smart, civilized, or good as the natives. Jesus would have faced all of those. We do know some things from Jesus' 30s. So if we don't know what happens in between, we know that the first 12 years are refugee and immigration and minority status. And we know that by 30, his cousin, John, also known as John the Baptist, a little older than Jesus, and from a richer family. John is living in the wilderness, eating what he can forage, mostly insects he can capture. And he's probably dressed in the one cloak he could find. And it's been through a lot. So that's how Jesus' rich cousin is living at that time. The rich cousin also becomes an enemy of the state, eventually is captured and executed as dinner entertainment. So if that's how the rich cousin is, you can imagine that Jesus is probably not that well off. In fact, we have no record of Jesus having a house as an adult. He seems to keep moving from place to place. Several times he sleeps out in the field or on the road. He tends to move at most days from place to place. He occasionally has some friends who have parents who have a house and let him do some counseling. But that never lasts very long. Gospel of Mark tells a story of once when Jesus was couch surfing. He's at a friend's house. Friend's father is sick, and Jesus is trying to heal the person, and the rowdy people who follow Jesus are ready to break down the door to get to him. And when they have the doors barricaded, they climb up on the roof and cut a hole down. I have the feeling that if I was staying at your house and the people who know me mobbed the house and started cutting the roof off, I would lose my welcome at your house. I would not be invited back. And so I'd go on to another place. Jesus makes friends who are fishers, and fishers work at night. And so he apparently is never very good with fishing, but they let him sleep on a wooden bunk on the boat at night while they work. That's the kind of very vulnerable immigrant life Jesus is living in his 30s. He gathers together a group of people, including a large number of people who were married and had families, but left their spouses and their families behind to follow Jesus. Most of these people had followed Jesus and broken apart their houses, their families. We would talk of Jesus as a homewrecker, not just as homeless himself. Jesus mentions once that foxes have places they can lay their head at night. I don't have any such thing. I just have nothing. We see Jesus with almost no possessions. When he is arrested and all his worldly goods are gathered together and divided up by the lot of executioners, all there is the cloak he was wearing. We read many times about Jesus getting hungry and going into somebody else's field at night and taking what he wants so he can eat and feed his friends. These are the practices of persistent homelessness. And Jesus is one of the kinds of immigrants who gets forced into that life. And I think Jesus is a hard worker. He seems to do some farm labor, and he seems to do some, I guess what we call light construction. But he's a day laborer. He knows where people in towns gather to see if anyone will come and hire them for the day. And he tells parables about people like that. And this is his life. And if he doesn't get work for a few days, he moves on to the next city. If he can't find a place to stay for long, he keeps moving. Depending how we read the Gospels, Jesus did the 400-mile round trip from Galilee to Jerusalem and back at least once a year. So every week or so, he walks 10 miles to the next town and starts over. That's some of how he gets the reputation, some of how he gets his talking preserved. Because when he comes to your town, he makes a big splash, he says all sorts of powerful things, and is then gone. So he gets widely known. If our churches have pictures of Jesus to hang on the wall, Jesus often is a flowing, perfectly white gown that no farm worker ever owned. And he's well-washed, clean skin, maybe a fair amount of product in his hair. This is not the Jesus as the Gospels projected. Somebody had been working for, maybe he was full-time employed and a migrant laborer at 15 and stayed that way to 30. He's had some broken bones that didn't heal right because he can't afford medical care. And the medical care at the time wasn't worth much anyway. So I think he had some broken teeth. He would have had, when he falls down to skin a knee, he doesn't have Neosporin to put on it or any antibiotic. And so the scars become more visible over time. At 30, he is looking like people who spent 20 years on the streets look like. We try to clean him up an awful lot, but we forget that Jesus looks more like the homeless, like the impoverished and insecure immigrants, the refugees, than Jesus looks like us city dwellers and house dwellers. And so when the Gospels end up remembering some Old Testament passages about Jesus as having been bruised for us, there's a reality to that. When God in heaven chose to become the earth immigrant Jesus and was not born into a fancy family, but just kind of average economics, he leads a rough life. And he's been bruised plenty in this life. He's been abused by the government. He's been cheated by people doing business with him because he doesn't speak their language well. He has been an outsider in every city he goes. And his body is broken. And his blood is shed. And the Gospels tell us that it's because of us. The early church was made up of a lot of immigrants. The early church was strong in the cities that had the highest immigrant populations. You think when Paul, he preaches at Pentecost, he is able to lean out the window, and there are people in his audience who speak hundreds of different languages. That means they are from 100 different places, 100 different nationalities and ethnicities, and each one of them had walked from wherever they started life to be in Jerusalem at the time. Those were the kind of immigrant groups that were always most attracted to Jesus' message and were the ones Jesus seems to have enjoyed spending time with the most. Sometimes when we read Matthew 25, where Jesus says, how you treat hungry people, how you treat homeless people, how you treat prisoners, how you treat sick people, is the same way you treat me. And so I know who loves me, because they'll show that compassion to all the sick and all the prisoners and all the homeless and all the immigrants. We have a tendency to read that as kind of Jesus being charitable and encouraging us to be charitable. When really Jesus is talking about his own life experience and what it's like to grow up in this world as an immigrant. As a refugee, as many other kinds of things. And he's giving his followers a mission. Several times in the ministry, he sends people out to different cities and says, go to nearby houses, ask if they'll let you stay for a few days, and if they'll give you food. And if they say yes and invite you in, be a good guest and help them understand how blessed they are by God. And if they don't let you in, just keep on going. Jesus is sending his disciples as immigrants to face the same kind of prejudices that immigrants always face. And for those who can open their door to an immigrant, they begin to understand the blessings of God. To those who can't even open their door or offer a bit of food, they're not going to understand God. I believe they will have other opportunities and may well, by God's grace, come along eventually. But when we see the homeless, when we see the immigrant, it is our time to decide, are we on the side of the empire? Are we on the side of the rich people, those who do human trafficking, those who don't respect the dignity of all, those who take advantage of millions of poor people so a few can be rich? Or are we on the side of Jesus the immigrant, of the God who immigrated to earth? I think if we were to understand this as the root of the gospel, it would give us a different basis and give us the motivation to do serious work on the treatment of immigrants all over our world today. I think we have a bit of time for questions.
Great. Thank you, John. Very interesting and challenging, and I have some ideas, but chair right here. Does someone want to come and ask a question? I'll bring a chair over here. Dell, you get ready to come up and make a comment?
You know me, I have a silly question.
Well, come up here and sit down. And Kathleen's also here, and Dell has she says a silly question. Are there no, maybe there are no silly questions, but I'll wait.
Oh, of course it's silly.
Of course, okay.
It's me.
I have some silly answers, so I'm ready.
When you talk about going back to where your ancestors are from, and I didn't know where I'd go because my father was pretty much, Scotch, Irish, English or something like that. But my mother's mother was Bohemian, and she came over as a child. And my mother's father was one of the Hessian soldiers that defected and went with the colonists in the Revolutionary War. So I don't even know what continent I'm going to go back to.
Well, if you had to go back to where your great-grandparents was, you have, let me do the math here, 2 parents, 4 great-grandparents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents.
Yeah.
Pick one.
Where would you want to go?
And show up there.
There can only be one.
Well, you don't want to go through the travel to go to 8 places.
It's hard to find a map of Bohemia today.
Right.
It just is like, but my aunt did find family in Czechoslovakia before it, in the what would now be the Czech Republic.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a contact there once upon a time for a little while.
Interesting.
Well, it's, you know, it gets worse in this generation with my family.
Well, along those lines, I was surprised when you said that today, because we think, we have such having immigrants in our country is such a big issue, like we can't hold anymore, and yet it's the least amount of immigrants, or I guess that's living
pretty low
now than there ever was.
Mm-hmm.
Just about, which is surprising. That's not the feeling you get, on the news.
Don't we have one of the lowest populations per square mile of any country except maybe Antarctica?
Certainly out in our country, the counties we do. But yeah, there is so much empty land.
Yes.
And when it comes to immigration, just a year ago, Poland opened up its borders to the Ukraine. And Poland took in 6 months, so many refugees that their national population went up 30%. Went up a little over 10 million new people in a country that's population is kind of like California, roughly. And yeah, we think if we see 2 immigrants at the grocery store, people will panic and say we're being overrun by immigrants. You don't imagine what 10 million people would do in 6 months.
It would have really made a change.
Yeah.
Somebody else must have
Any
a more
other
serious
questions?
question.
Yep, Kathleen, come on up here.
Hi, Dr. Berquist.
Hey.
You mentioned how, the rich people, they do have the opportunity to change lives by opening the door to immigrants, by opening the door to those less fortunate. Jesus, wouldn't you say, was taking people, knocking on their doors, being invited in to those homes with people with influence, even Zacchaeus, who was a sinner, but was wealthy, and changing their lives. I mean, so he did make a difference in a lot of people's lives in that vein too, right? It wasn't really a question. It wasn't really a question, but...
Well, yeah, it's interesting to see Jesus as a homeless person kind of roaming about and having rich people invite him in as an act of compassion and acceptance, and then him turning around and saying, this is what, it is to be like God.
And many times he never knew he wouldn't know what to expect, to be welcomed or not, but, so.
There was a tradition in ancient Greece leading up to and during the time of Jesus. We don't really know if this was practiced in the Greek colonies and in the Palestine-Israel areas or not. But in a few of the Greek cities, it was very formalized and legalized. There are no taxes. Nobody owes taxes. But they keep strict count, probably not of everybody's wealth, but of the wealth of the people who are near the top. And everybody wants to be known as the wealthiest. And the law is that when the census happens, when the tax bill comes due, the richest family in town needs to give away enough of the money during the year that they are no longer among the rich. And it was enough income inequality that if you put a 95% tax on the richest family, it could pay for everything. A lot of what they did was spend the whole year throwing expensive banquets at their houses to give food away. And so Jesus talks about several of those banquets and how when you're invited, you need to go. And there's some stories about banquet owners who are rich people throwing big banquets, and they invite their friends and their family, and their friends and family don't show for whatever reason. And so they have to keep going back into the street and asking anybody living out there to come inside and dine. And it's a very personal way of paying your taxes.
I would say so.
It's very face-to-face. It's very much at the level of table fellowship and human connection. And I think some of that was going on in the places where Jesus traveled. And so as a homeless person new to town, he could get invited to some pretty big banquets with big important people. And he got into those contexts, and he tried to convert them.
Would his, he's in the Bible, he's listed as going to some Pharisees' homes, and they seem to be having a very nice home, and
Yes.
And he actually confronts one of them because he didn't get treated very well. I think that's how that goes. Somebody didn't get treated well. Somebody didn't get treated well. But I'm wondering if they also might have been. That might have been a required. Now my imagination's going like how many of these banquets were forced upon people.
The Pharisees were not so much a religious denomination. They were the group of Jews who were appointed to sit on the city council. So they are high-ranking government officials. And actually the name Pharisee comes from a word that means to keep separate. And part of what the Pharisees were supposed to stay above the rabble and not be very accessible in order to maintain an objective government perspective. Like a social worker, if you go in for food assistance, we'll get your name, get your details, but it's not supposed to have permanent access to that. If you see them outside, they're not supposed to know your name. There's a separation that makes the government look neutral. And Jesus had a big habit of taking all of the ways we try to stay neutral and unconnected and messing them up.
Jim, did you have a thought? I see you actually opening the Bible, which is always very encouraging in Bible study to have. Yeah.
Very
Do
good.
you want to come up and sit down? We'll get last question. We have time for one more? Yeah.
I really don't have a question.
Well, what were you looking up?
I was always of the opinion, I guess, I just hadn't thought much, that Jesus had returned back, and his family had returned back to Israel in his early years. And I was looking up on that, and it doesn't give a time frame at all in Matthew at all. It just says when Herod died, and I don't know that.
Jim was saying
chronology at all.
Jim was saying he was under the impression that Jesus came back and the family came back from Egypt to Nazareth or to Galilee
Yeah.
earlier. but he couldn't find any kind of scripture. What about,
Yeah.
yeah, what about when
Yeah.
he was, didn't he have his, didn't he go to the temple for some sort of bar mitzvah or something like that?
When he was 12.
That was when he was 12, that's, okay.
It was for Passover, and he was 12 or 13.
So that's the only time we know for sure he was back.
So we know that he got out of the country by the age of 2. We know that he's back in the country by the age of 13.
Okay,
And so whether he stayed in Egypt a couple months or several years, we don't know.
right.
We visited the home in Cairo, but they had a map of 17 places in Egypt where Jesus lived, and that suddenly made more sense to me.
Oh.
That it wouldn't have been for a few months if he lived there for,
Did you hear that? Jim, when Jim was in Egypt, they, in Cairo,
yeah.
they went to places that were depicted as being homes that Jesus and his family lived in, and there were 17 different homes
Yeah, not just in
Yeah, and the
throughout
idea
Egypt.
that
throughout
Jesus
Egypt.
and his family are, following the work. They're
Yeah.
migrant labor.
So that would make sense. Now you see why was
And
it
so
three
they
homes?
follow a path.
Very interesting. Well, I feel like my son was definitely on. I always wonder about, because he went to, I'll just say he went to Whitworth College, where Presbyterian ministers send their kids to become, evangelical Presbyterians, whatever that is. Anyways, he went there, and he sent us back a picture of him, and he looked just like he was homeless. He had a ragged T-shirt on, and he was hanging out in a warehouse area, and he wrote back, he said, "Dad, I really feel like I want to drop out of school and go live under the bridge with people." And I just thought, that's the craziest thing in the world. But now after you talking, he probably heard something in the Gospels that made him think that's what Jesus did. I never told him that's what Jesus did.
From what I can tell, most young adults in their late 20s or 30s are either living with mom or they're never doing their laundry.
I know what I was going to say.
There are a few exceptions, but
Yeah. Okay.
yeah.
All right, Raphael? Yes.
I have a question.
Okay, Raphael, come up here.
Sure.
Take the hot seat. And then, Raphael, this is good, 'cause he's always behind the scenes, but he's...
Yes.
Dr. Bergquist, great to see you.
Hey, Raphael.
Welcome, and this time I'll speak to you in English. I just have a quick question as you're talking about statesmen and politicians and the relationship between, people, everyday people, and how their lives are ruled by these regulations that politicians make. What is your relationship personally with elected officials and statesmen, people that have the power to make policy and make decisions on how immigration issues are treated today?
Yeah, I've known a few politicians, had students of mine who became city council members and school board members and mayor of their city. And I see good people who are trying to have a more compassionate government. And typically, in the people I've known who were in the local level politics, they spend a lot of time getting to know people in the neighborhoods and helping people get what services are available. I think we all know we have two problems that are separate but really entwined. One is the government doesn't have enough programs of assistance to manage the problem. And the other is that it's really hard for someone who needs assistance and qualifies to actually find out about it, get to the right place, make the right application, and receive. There's a failure of communication. And those two are in. And the elected officials I've seen spend a lot of time trying to help make those contacts.
Very good. Thank you.
Are we, and I know we need to get moving on, are we going to, that's an interesting question about, you said that God, generally saves in a way that helps a lot of people. So you have, your one person that's praying for a place to sleep, and the Lord provides right out here on our front steps, and they have a safe place for the night, and then they get a blessings bag from the Stonewall Ministry, and maybe a Bible, and a conversation with the pastor. But is there a bigger way that, are we going to talk about, different ways that God can reach out and help the situation for immigrants and homeless?
I think it's a pretty big thing that God has told all of God's followers to take care of all the strangers we meet. When God asked the question pretty early on to one of to the third human, according to Genesis, where is your brother? And he responded, why should I know? Am I my brother's keeper? The answer is, well, he sure should have been. And if he wasn't his brother's keeper, he ended up being his brother's murderer. And in the case of immigrants, strangers, refugees, God has been asking us the question, and we keep saying, am I these person's keeper? Is it my responsibility to make sure everyone can eat and everyone can be housed? And the right answer is yes, it is our responsibility. And we need to step up and take that. My own style is to try to get local politicians who will have better policies and pass laws and spend money in a way that helps. And to learn where the local support services are and help direct people there. And that can make a huge difference. Again, one of the other churches I've been working with got in touch with one of the local government agencies and said, what can we do to help? And they said that most of their funded programs where there's cash in the bank for certain purposes, they can't spend more than 5% of it because nobody knows. And helping to make some of those connections could be a really powerful thing for churches to do.
Well, we are really in a location for that. We've moved from being really isolated from a lot of people that are homeless and in difficulty to being, you could just be here and watch people cross the street, walk along the street, wake them up in the morning. So if we have certainly the close proximity to get to know people and to help them get the right resources.
We find them here.
Yeah, they're right outside. Yeah, so. Well, thank you, Dr. Berquist. Now, what about next week? Do you have any kind of a teaser for us?
We're going to go back to Genesis 11.
Okay.
It's the story of Babel.
Okay.
And we're going to watch that story and then watch how it unfolds and gets echoed.
Right. Okay.
Because Babel is a place where everyone wants to come together, and God ends up turning them all into immigrants and sending them out.
That's right. Okay. Another huge immigrant story. Okay. Well,
Yes.
thank you very much. We look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you again.
Hey, I look forward to this too. Take care, everyone.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye. I should have that so he can see all of you, but it's so bright out there. Like if I did this,
No, you would.
it would be really bright.